It is an important thing for people to go out there and vote because it's been a while. These elections should have been held like yesterday.
What to me is even more interesting is what's going to happen after the elections, because without the BJP, one really can't look to form a government in Jammu and Kashmir right now.
I think what has been damaged the most between India and Bangladesh at that point in time is about the issue of trust. That trust rebuilding will take time.
From an Indian perspective, did we overinvest in Sheikh Hasina?
There was, China's been involved, America's been involved. So what is India doing? Where is the intelligence feedback? Where is the diplomatic feedback that something really large is building?
Hi, and welcome to episode 27 of the India Dialogue. My name is Ruchir. I'm joined by my co-host Mitali, and we have special guests who you've seen before on the show, Rishi and Smita. Let me introduce Smita first. Smita is a very senior journalist known for her time from India Today. She's a visiting faculty at the Kautilya School of Public Policy and has her own YouTube channel. Rishi Suri is the editor of the oldest Urdu newspaper in India called the Daily Milap, and previously served as a media advisor to Kashmir Chief Minister Mehbooba Mufti. Mitali, as you know, is known for her time at CNBC. She's the acting director at the Reuters Institute in Oxford, and has written a book on crypto crimes. And I'm Ruchir. I'm the CEO at Distributed Energy and chair at the School of Policy and Governance. Every week we go through issues that matter to India. We try and unpack them meaningfully, friendly disagreements or not. The idea is to try and look at issues from different sides. By bringing Rishi and Smita, we've given you a hint on what we'll try and cover today. We'll open with the announcement on Kashmir elections. Mitali, why don't you take us away?
Yeah, Richard, thank you. And always great to see India Dialogue family join in. So welcome, Rishi and Smita. This is a story which I think people have been talking about for a while, especially since the general elections were held. Now we have word and confirmation that there will be regional elections in Jammu and Kashmir from the 18th of September. Why is this important? Well, first of all, because it's the first time that polls are being held in nearly a decade in that region. The second is, of course, this is the first time it's happening ever since the current BJP government revoked the region's special status that happened in 2019. And of course, it is a sizable population we're talking about. It is nearly 8.7 million people, half of them are women. We did see some turnout happen, obviously not as much as you saw in many other key states during the general elections, but this is a big one for the state because it's something that both local leaders and opposition members have been asking for a long time. Remember, after the special status was taken away for Kashmir, we had basically seen the government split that state into two federally administered territories, that's Ladakh and Jammu and Kashmir. So a lot of everything that's gone down since that revocation will come up for discussion, as also local issues and national issues. Let me start with Rishi, who's been an observer of the region for a long time, at one point closely associated with the state government as well. Rishi, how do you read the timing of it? What do you think is going to be top of mind for people stepping up to vote?
Thanks, Mitali. Yes, excellent to start with this topic. And you're right, truly momentous because after the abrogation of 370, this is, other than the Sabha elections which just happened, this is perhaps more important for the local people because this is now restoring statehood, getting the assembly back in, and getting local politics active back once again. So it's going to be very interesting to see what happens. I think there was a fantastic, in terms of at least by Kashmir standards, the turnout was quite fantastic in the Lok Sabha elections. It broke all records for, I don't know, a few decades. So they clearly, the people want to vote and they want to exercise their right the Democratic side. So that's a good thing. What's really interesting to me is the landscape, the political landscape in Kashmir. And when I say Kashmir, because Jammu and Kashmir, Jammu is dominated by the BJP, so there's really not much point discussing that there. But Kashmir is very interesting because earlier, for the longest time, there were two parties which were clearly the only two which were dominating, which was National Conference headed by the Abdullahs and the PDP headed by Mufti Sahib. But now, of course, there's about three or four other parties like the People's Conference, Apni Party, the Azad Party, Ghulam Nabi Azad's party. So even though the smaller parties are not looking to get more than 5, 6 seats, if they're lucky, they will make a dent in the way people vote because the vote gets fractured. And it's very interesting to see. And we got a little trailer of that in the Lok Sabha elections on how the real big ticket leaders actually lost their seats and people who were a little unexpected actually won. But having said that, what to me is even more interesting is what's going to happen after the elections, because without the BJP, one really can't look to form a government in Jammu and Kashmir right now because Jammu, as I said, is dominated by the BJP. So it'll have to be a coalition with the BJP. And every single party has refused, at least the bigger ones have refused outright that they will have anything to do with the BJP. In fact, I think almost all of them, the top point in their manifesto is getting Article 370 back. So I don't know how that's going to work, but very, very interesting at the same time. So I think it's going to be an interesting time. We actually see people jumping ship every day now since the election announcement has happened, and literally on a daily basis we have like 5, 6 leaders joining some party or the other and leading some party or the other. So fascinating times ahead. But I'm glad that true democracy is coming back to Kashmir. Kashmir will now vote for its own assembly.
Well, can I quickly ask, why did it take 5 years to announce? Like, why so long?
Because the court only told them to do it before this October. So, Supreme Court ruled last year that you have to have elections in the store stated before October 2024. But I mean, having said that, after 370 was gone, there was a fair bit that needed to be done, which I don't think a local government would have managed to do. So they needed a little strong hand from the center to do a lot of those things. Good or bad, that's up to debate. But there were a lot of things that the government wanted to do, a lot of security issues that they needed to take care of, even though it's not completely taken care of as we see what's happening in Jammu in the last few months. But at the same time, they had a vision, they wanted to do those things. They've, at least to some extent, they've done them. So I think it's a good time to call for elections and get people to vote again.
Smita, let me draw you in on the point that Rishi made specifically about Jammu, with sort of an eye on what the military and security developments have been in the region in the last year or so. Do you agree that it's a given that the BJP still continues to hold the kind of support in Jammu that it did?
I wouldn't be too sure of that at this point in time, that it has a complete sway of things. I mean, as Rishi was also mentioning, that there are a lot of people switching sides. Speculations have been rife if Ghulam Nabi Azad will come back to the Congress. Rahul Gandhi clearly has started focusing on Jammu and Kashmir. He's starting to do his meetings from Jammu. And look, I mean, at the end of the day, we need to remember, Mitali, you said that in the decade, it's kind of the first elections that we are seeing, not for the state, but for a union territory legislature. Because 2014, there was that very sort of unthinkable kind of a coalition between the PDP and the BJP. It is like two opposite poles that came together. And 2018, it was the BJP that pulled the rug off the PDP. So for the longest, BJP, in its political, of course, legacy, career, has always defined the PDP as something which is an extremist party, something which has sided with, radicalists or with secessionists and separatists. But when it came to, being in power, the BJP was very much comfortable in cobbling up that alliance. And when the BJP pulled that rug, there was obviously bad blood. There was also some blowback for the BJP itself. So I think one of the reasons that you haven't seen elections take place so long, and that is the question that was being asked by everybody, that if you continued to raise these claims that normalcy had returned to Jammu and Kashmir post the abrogation of Article 370. And that, you were showing these images that tourists are coming in large numbers. The Prime Minister is going there, waving out to the mountains from the Dal Lake. But seriously, I mean, why would it take so long till such time that the apex court had to literally danda karo ki bhai ho gaya, aap kar lo election. And then also you see this narrative constantly being asked, is the security situation all right? Look, it is a very serious problem what we are seeing in Jammu right now. I mean, Jammu used to be comparatively the peace station to Kashmir. The militancy that broke out in the 90s in Kashmir, the kind of insurgency that we have seen in Kashmir, Jammu used to be much quieter. And now if you have the infiltration happening, not from the line of control, but from the international border, and there's a serious spark in terms of not just the attacks that are happening, not just the change in tactics that are happening in this region, but also in terms of the number of lives that have been lost of our Jawans, of our security personnel. So that does put a big question mark on the claims of normalcy that this government has been sort of drumming up constantly in the last 5 years. So I think all said and done right now, it is an important thing for people to go out there and vote because it's been a while. These elections should have been held like yesterday. B, the people there are currently in a situation where the Lieutenant Governor's power ambit has been expanded extensively. Mr. Manoj Sinha right now enjoys a whole degree of powers, right from whether it's the bureaucracy, whether it's the agencies. So, and that is not something that people think as their own representative. So in a political system, when you have, whether it's an engineer, Rashid, coming out of jail to be able to fight elections, whether it's a PDP, whether it's a national conference. I mean, at the end of the day, these are also the parties that, remember, the BJP for the longest in these last 5-6 years have tried delegitimizing to its best. And now it's also looking at these parties essentially to try and put up once again that argument that no, we are moving towards a democracy because these parties are being able to fight elections. So there have been contradictions as far as the BJP's positions on Jammu Kashmir are concerned. Jammu, I do agree, yes, BJP is in a stronger position, but I wouldn't say that they can completely sway it right now. We'll have to see. There is some sort of a turnaround that you're seeing in a lot of other states too. The BJP is looking on a back foot on a lot of issues today. I mean, within a few hours today, you've seen them being forced to, roll back the advertisement yesterday that there would be lateral entrance into the UPSC. And Mr. Ashwini Vaishnav had to do a complete 360-degree turn in two of his tweets. It was a story by itself. So in this NDA 3.0, which is a coalition existence for the BJP, things are different. Things are not the same post Lok Sabha elections. So I don't think it is going to be a complete dominant sweep for the BJP. We'll have to wait and watch. But at least I'm happy that these elections are happening. The next step hopefully should be to return back the dignity to Jammu and Kashmir and restore their statehood.
I have a question around the practicalities of going from statehood to union territory to statehood again. And maybe we need the legal expert Manu who's missing today. But how does this work now? So is Jammu and Kashmir become a state after the elections? Are they reconstituted? So I believe that there are 90 new seats from 87 before. Have they completely reframed all the seats with the commission that was appointed, or are they very similar? And also, a follow-up question for either of you is: have the parties changed dramatically in terms of their ground game? Are they the same parties? Because it's been such a long time. Are they the same parties that were there before the abrogation?
As of now, to my understanding, they are doing elections as a union territory, and then statehood will be restored, perhaps right after, or maybe at a later point. But I would imagine right after.
No, actually, it's not been promised yet. I mean, it's a hope
It's not
that there
been
will be
promised,
steps
yeah,
taken to restore the statehood.
Yeah, but possibly, I mean, soon, I would say. I don't think they'll drag it on for too long once the elections happen. So exactly how it will work, I'm not very well versed with it, so I'll probably defer to Smita if she would get to answer that. On the second part of your question, I just say that the ground strategy of the parties is more or less the same, other than the fact that the getting back Article 370 is one of the big things that they're touting and trying to sell to people now. I'm personally not sure how much they'll be able to sell that to people, because at least not in Srinagar, maybe outside perhaps they'll manage. Uh, Basically, with the tourism boom that's happened in the last 2 3 years, uh, it gets very difficult to convince someone who's doing well in their business or a person who's doing well otherwise, a taxi driver, a shikana driver, whoever, uh, that that this is bad and earlier was good. So it's going to be interesting to see what happens there. But I think for me, at least visibly, the big change is that they keep saying that they're going to get Article 370 back, which again, Manu should have been here. I don't think constitutionally that's going to be possible, but let's see.
It will actually depend on the numbers that a party gets to win. Say, for instance, if the national conference is in a comfortable number, I mean, if they will have to bring in that resolution. I'm guessing into their own legislature first, the Union Territory legislature right now, to some sort of a restoration of statehood. But it will obviously need some coordination with the center too. It will depend on how much of seats they are able to win, because this is one of the promises that both the parties are making. I mean, National Conference today has released its manifesto, and one of the key promises is that they will, restore statehood. Also, talking about the pre-1953 autonomy status that they had promised in 2000, bringing that back into the manifesto. Look, the point is here, and I know the next story that you're discussing is Bangladesh. I think the only interesting comparison that I see is in Bangladesh today, a lot of young people, and if you look at the ground reports, they keep on saying that while there has been development, this movement was all about our odhikar or our rights. So I think in Kashmir, while we are talking about tourism, while we are talking about increasing number of tourists, without a doubt, there has been an atmosphere of subdued voices. There has been an atmosphere of people's voices becoming more submissive. The press has been really cracked down upon in these last couple of years. Most of the newspaper, in fact, companies have either been wrapped up. There are people who have been sent to jail. There are journalists and leaders who have been put on exit control lists. So somewhere this will turn up into that fight between, okay, you may be turning Srinagar into a smart city. Okay, you may be transforming Srinagar's boulevard area into a more beautiful area, where the shops look beautiful. They're open till late evening. But Kashmir has always been about the issue of political rights and political freedoms and that voice. So, to allow that voice of the people, I think this is a first very necessary step right now. At least let those people go out and cast their vote, select a party which they think is their own, select an individual which they think still represents them, and then hopefully, because the interesting situation, if you remember, this is also the first time that an election is happening where Jammu Kashmir is polling without Ladakh. Ladakh doesn't even have a legislature now. I mean, Ladakh ki halat to bichari aur kharab ho gayi hai. Whereas the Ladakhis were the one who were actually out on the streets celebrating the revocation of 370. Today, you see the last 1 year from a Sonam Wangchuk to entire numbers of Ladakhis, which is quite unprecedented given Ladakh's size, small size, out on the streets demanding for their political rights. So if this is only framed as, look, we gave you tourists, look, we gave you business, I think the center will be again sort of walking into a slippery slope. The elections are about people's political rights. The elections are about people's dignity in Jammu and Kashmir. And I think that's where the people will want to go out there and make their voice heard, hopefully in good numbers.
One last thing. Another good thing that I at least see till now of the seats that have been announced of the people who've been announced that they'll be fighting elections is that there's a lot of young new leaders that are coming in and fighting elections, which I think is excellent. Some of them obviously dynasties, political dynasty, but some which are not from political families as well. So I think for me that's another very big positive that I see. As I said, and Smith was right, it'll depend on what happens and when people vote and things like that. But these are all good signs in my book, no matter what the narrative is.
Rishi, my question was actually more about, the point you were making about, I mean, if the BJP, as you say, is said to be the key, one of the key constituents in this entire process, and people will obviously gauge them and judge them for performance when they go out and vote. Um, Do you have at hand any sort of economic parameters that actually point to much sharper development or improvement, especially ever since the abrogation? Because all the data that I have at hand, first of all, indicates that J&K was actually doing much better than other states on different parameters, whether it was economic growth or, frankly, even literacy. Um, are there sort of concrete numbers here that point to, because part of the part of the reason when this abrogation happened was, well, here comes industrialization, right? I mean, you remember Amit Shah's speeches in parliament saying there's going to be a blitz of industry, we're going to hold all these conclaves, people are going to be rushing to set up factories and provide employment. Do we have any concrete numbers on, like, sort of real economic development on ground that the people can gauge performance by?
So the numbers that are there are more at a promise level right now. There have been a lot of investments, especially internationally, promised specifically in Kashmir. A bunch of them from the UAE as well. But they still, I mean, it's a very early stage right now. They haven't, like, for example, one of them, they've announced a big mall right outside Srinagar, but they haven't even, the land is there, but they haven't begun work there. So it's all at a very early level. And you're right on that, that honestly, Kashmir was pretty good even well before 370 on most parameters. Nobody was homeless. You would not see people begging there. Education levels were very, very good. Everybody had the basics were taken care of. But that's also because of the kind of money that the center was spending in Kashmir. It was, I mean, it was unparalleled what the center spent in Kashmir over like almost
But yeah,
25
why
years.
is it early stage? है ना, 5 साल हो गए इस बात को to the
It's,
abrogation.
you know,
Like,
so I tell you what, 30 years of problems, give it another 5 years.
Smita, do you want to sort of join in on that, just in terms
No,
of,
no, I think there is, listen, there is a, I mean, there is optics and then there is substance. There is a lot of drumming up of these glitzy events and saying that some things may have happened, but I also do know that it's not like there has been a severe reduction in corruption, for instance. At the local level, people are complaining about huge corruption that they're having to deal with on a daily issue. So it's not like the LG rule has meant that every corrupt weed has been weeded out. Secondly,
no, listen, but
obviously,
did you dial Rishi, Smita, before you should have dialed Rishi.
I know. The second thing is, if you look at the manifestos again, people are being promised free electricity. People are being promised better thermoelectricity and also LPG cylinders, which are indicators that basically not all is well economically within the society. Joblessness is a real problem within Jammu and Kashmir. You have a whole bunch of young people, so it's not very separate from other parts of India, where you may gloss over and say that India's demographic dividend is doing great, and our economic growth rate, and you are the guru here, Mitali, on the K shapes and the V shapes and all of that, and I don't even understand. But the point is that joblessness is a harsh reality, so it also applies to Kashmir. I think people basically do expect that the next government will talk about their rights, but also the development that is being shown off in paper is not something that is translated there. I mean, even this Lal Chowk beautification project that everybody keeps talking about and going gaga about, I went in January this year. Honestly, I mean, I still couldn't find one clean loo in that entire area, which is bustling with tourists. Even the
But
loos in
that's,
the popular hotels. It speaks
unfortunately, that's
volumes
most of
about,
India.
yeah, when places are developing, one would think that some basic infrastructure, at least those soch lo kar lo, some visible changes I'm saying about.
Yeah.
It may sound very, very basic, but it's just a point to make that I think there is a divide. There is a divide between what is intended. I am not completely disregarding the fact that yes, the central government has tried getting in investors. There are investors who have promised investments. You have seen during G20 also certain envoys being flown in. You have seen a lot of halchals, fashion shows happening, things like that happening. But this election is really about, again, as I'm repeating, it's about the political voice to people, whether they feel that they have an actual representation or not just about counting the number of tourists coming in.
Yeah, and I have one final question before, Ruchir, I'm sure, has many, and perhaps Rishi, this is more to you because you've watched this region for a long time. I think personally, what I find really deeply disturbing is the increasing data that is being presented about the drug addiction and drug use problem in J&K. Part of it is, of course, pointing to the point that Smita is raising of joblessness, a young and sort of frustrated population, frustrations that are both political and otherwise. What's your own sort of on ground observation been? And for all parties, this is not about the BJP, for all parties, really, what is the approach to address this?
No, you're absolutely right. It's a serious, serious problem, and it's growing very, very fast in especially in Kashmir. And I mean, I don't want to blame an external force for it, but unfortunately, it's narco terrorism, as they call it, from across the border. The fact that there is joblessness will obviously fuel it even more in its own way. So I think obviously local parties, local government, once they come in place, will have their work cut out on making sure that there's enough rehabilitation and de-addiction programs and things like that. Obviously, creating jobs as well. But other than that, I think the center needs to and the forces need to work a little harder to stop drugs from coming in from across the other side. Unfortunately, drones are playing a very big role in this. BSF has set up a full drone surveillance wing there, which they're trying to tackle. But yeah, I mean, the size of the border is not. I mean, doesn't make it easier by any stretch. So I think as in Punjab, the same in Jammu and Kashmir is going to need a cohesive approach from the the local government, the central government forces, everybody together, and of course the civil society as well, because it is. I mean, I've seen it. I mean, within 1 year, it is just gone from bad to worse. I didn't expect it to get so bad so fast, but it has.
I have a question around the safety and the security piece. Perhaps it's a nice, naive question. I understand the politics between India and Pakistan around Kashmir and all of our history attached to it. But in many ways, a lot of the security situation is relatively calm on the rest of our border. What is the primary challenge on the border in Kashmir, especially around um, all of uh, the incursions or the bomb blasts and so on? Is this primarily to destabilize and make the local population, think that they are safer with Pakistan than they are with India? Like, how do you view the amount of activity that is being managed on the border, specifically in Kashmir, say relative to the rest of our borders? I'm curious. I've never asked anybody that question, so I'd be interested in what you both of you think.
I'm not sure I got the question, Richard.
What is the intention of having more drama? Drama is such a bad word, actually. More problems attached to incursions or like explosions or attacks in Kashmir relative to the rest of our border. Is that primarily because the elements, say in Pakistan, want the Indian population to feel that India is not safe for them? Like why concentrate all of the activity there, say relative to Punjab
Well,
or
to begin with, because that's a uh, that is the disputed border. When you talk that is the disputed region. That is the region where Pakistan also makes its claims, and of course, if you look at international media organizations, that's the region where, depending on which side of the divide you are, it's talked about the Indian administered Kashmir. What we called as Pakistan occupied Kashmir is talked about as the Pak administered Kashmir in the international media. It's the gel for the Pakistan army. I mean, at the end of the day, it's the key existential sort of identity glue for the Pakistan establishment, to keep its entire forces together. India has been the quintessential enemy, and Kashmir is at the center stage of this entire fight. So it's really not about the fight over Punjab, but LOC is from where they have been pushing in not just the terrorists, but also the Pakistani forces as well, the Pakistani soldiers as well. And for the longest time, keeping in mind that in Jammu and Kashmir, when you had the conflict going with the insurgency in the 90s, you had a population that was constantly, the generation after generation, being born in a conflict mode. So the whole idea is to obviously keep it unstable, to keep the pot boiling, to make it difficult, and to continue to lay your claims over a region which is not yours. So that's at the core of it. But if you are saying that, why are they not pushing terrorists from Punjab? Look, is that also a part of the question, Ruchir?
No, I'm saying why focus on Kashmir? Because there is an assumption in my question, and maybe Rishi can answer this. How does the security situation weave into the state politics? That's where I'm really going with my question. Like, is this primarily about state politics?
So, not really. I mean, I that would probably imply that the local politicians are somehow involved in something which they should not be. But I don't think so. I mean, there were obviously separatists. There were people who were rightly supporting Pakistan for the longest time in Kashmir. All that is now. I mean, it's yesterday's news now. Most of them have kind of wound up their shops, so to say. Of course, one or two people are still there who batter the separatist agenda, but that's all. I mean, it's basically on his way out now. Even Mirwais, who was like I mean, he's one of the obviously the religious figureheads. Even he, in his earlier sermons, would be quite critical of India, which he's toned down now. Mostly because he was detained for the longest time. But at the same time, he has toned himself down for good reason. But what is also very interesting, which is going back to the first part of your question, is Tilak Devasher. He serves on the National Security Council and is a Afghanistan Pakistan expert. He's written a fantastic book on the Pashtuns as well. He was on a podcast, I think, day before or yesterday, and what he said was very interesting. He said, the recent attacks that are happening in Jammu, Samba region, that we've all been hearing of and seeing. That is, according to him, a desperate attempt by the Pakistani army to try and regain legitimacy within Pakistan. His point was that the Pakistan army right now doesn't enjoy the kind of support they've always enjoyed in Pakistan. There is a large part of the population which is very, very critical towards them now, especially after Imran Khan and things like that. And he feels that they will keep making things more difficult for India in this region and put all their resources there in a hope that India retaliates in some way or the other. In what way, nobody knows, but in some way. And that is when possibly they will drum up this entire thing again in Pakistan that, look, I mean, you're safe because of us, and like if we weren't here, India would take you over and stuff like that. So it's an interesting point. I don't know. I don't know if I completely agree with it, but it somewhat did make sense, at least to an extent. So it was quite interesting.
So the next topic is about a neighbor. Obviously, Smita mentioned it. It's Bangladesh. Sheikh Hasina resigned as Prime Minister of Bangladesh on the 5th of August. A bunch of things built up to it. There was a job quota system announced where there was reservation for veterans of 1971 war and their descendants. Obviously, students came out unhappy around the reservation. The court struck it down, but then the protest became about sort of the broader progress of Bangladesh, including the corruption from the government. There are reports that the violence escalated quite dramatically, led to deaths, and eventually the military got involved and let the prime minister know that she no longer has the support of the military, and so she resigned on the 5th, and I believe now she is in India. Obviously, the last comment now, there is an interim government with Dr. Mohammad Yunus, the Nobel Peace Prize winner, as an advisor. But I'd love to hear from Rishi and Smita what they think of these developments, especially like the build-up and now what we foresee in Bangladesh. Smita, do you want to give us your view on the current state of affairs?
Well, sure. I mean, actually, I'm also headed to Dhaka this week in 2 days' time. So once I'm there on the ground, I'll have a better sense of what's happening. But from what I do read and pick up, and through my conversations with people out there in Dhaka, friends and political, I do understand, of course, that the situation is a lot calmer now comparatively to what it was in that week leading up to the events where Sheikh Hasina was forced to resign. You saw that ouster, those dramatic images of her flying out Agartala and then a C-130 flying her into the Indian Air Base in Ghaziabad. And she's still actually around in the Noida Ghaziabad area in a safe house of sorts. And I don't see her going anytime soon. I think that she will be here for a while right now, because India has also made it clear that it's not going to abandon somebody that it had trusted for long, despite that being a potential blowback figure on the streets of a blowback issue on the streets of Dhaka against India. So the situation there at the moment is, it's an uneasy calm. Things have started to calm down in the sense that obviously people have gone back, some schools have opened up, policemen, by hundreds and thousands of policemen who had fled the police stations as angry mobs attacked them because they were seen as being too close to the Awami League establishment. And also they were accused of essentially opening fire at peaceful protests that completely turned the entire nature of the protests, and that became into such violent agitations and angry agitations. So a lot of the policemen have returned to the police stations. You have a caretaker interim government that is trying to run things. It also actually has two very young people, two of the protesters who are just 26-year-old. They are also a part of the cabinet right now. And you have a Tawheed Hussain, of an old diplomatic hand who has come in into the foreign, into the foreign ministries in charge of things there. It's obviously, I think, what has been damaged the most between India and Bangladesh at that point in time is about the issue of trust. That trust rebuilding will take time. It's going to be a slow process. There are slow steps, small steps that are being taken. But as far as Sheikh Hasina is concerned, I've just started. It's actually true that for anybody who is in power for too long, absolute power does corrupt. And I think people start to become complacent. They start to live in denial of what is happening. I mean, imagine the irony that Sheikh Hasina's leaders are coming to media and saying that, oh, we are banning Jamaat-e-Islami, without even having information that the Jamaat-e-Islami is actually going into meetings with the Bangladesh army or with the opposition figures. Sheikh Hasina should have seen this coming. And this is what I was trying to draw the analogy, that in the last few years, and I've had conversations with several people from Bangladesh on my YouTube station, where they do believe that for India, of course, it was convenient, given our historic ties with Sheikh Hasina, with Sheikh Mujibur Rahman, India's military role, India's political role in the 1971 Bangladesh Liberation War. And Sheikh Hasina did do a lot of things that were beneficial to India, whether it's on the economic side, whether it's on the security side, cracking down on the so-called radical elements with whom she actually started flirting with also in the last few years. So while she was doing these things, I think she was overselling the Bangladesh economy story. And that Bangladesh economy story and glitz again was being oversold to sort of gloss over the trust deficit that had happened between her and civil society. At the end of the day, when you take away all these powers from the opposition, I mean, this January election was actually farcical. The elections that were held in January was actually, in a way, the last nail in the coffin for the Awami League regime. Because that build-up had been so long, that pent-up anger had been so long of people not being able to express themselves, that freedom of expression, that right to speech, the opposition leaders being jailed. There were serious, in fact, investigations happening about detention centers called Aina Ghar, where, a lot of enforced disappearances were happening. People were getting arrested, people were getting detained and were being taken into these centers. But nobody in India, in Indian media, or because of the friendly terms, was talking about it. Similarly, I think she herself and her coterie of advisors were not giving her the feedback that she needed at this point in time. I remember covering the Shahbag protests in 2013, which was also led by bloggers. There were killings of bloggers that had happened. And from that point in time itself, while that protest was handled eventually and things calmed down, from that point in time, there was an increased muzzling of free speech that was happening within the country. People were not being able to express themselves, particularly who were critical. And you see today that there is a very interesting parallel. Some of the biggest media houses of Bangladesh have been attacked, and it is horrific, which is absolutely condemnable. Those media houses are being called Bangladesh's Godi media. What you see in India today, of what is, essentially the very aligned with government, pro-government media. who the public thought that they are not showing the other side of the story. They are not letting our voices come through. So it was a pressure cooker situation where, because you had not provided any vent to the people to basically express their anger, express their voice, you may give them great roles. You may give them this story that Bangladesh's garment story is booming. But there were cracks that had appeared in this economic story post COVID. Add to this the joblessness situation. Add to this then the fact that young students, and I mean, for Sheikh Hasina to turn around and tell an entire young generation of people that you are Razakar. Razakar are the people who collaborated with the Pakistani army during Bangladesh's liberation war. You're telling these 20-year-olds that you are Razakar today. And which people in our media actually pointed to say, oh, see, they are actually traitors. No, they're not traitors. They're being sarcastic about it. They are owning up an abuse which Sheikh Hasina mounted on them. So there were problems. Somebody like an Avinash Paliwal, who is in the UK, who is a professor, he had been writing about the shifting sands in, reading the tea leaves in Bangladesh. People were looking at him and saying that, oh, you're talking from an American perspective, a British perspective, you're not knowledgeable about it. There were signs, but I think power really corrupts. Leaders stop listening, no matter, how good they were in the initial years. They just stop taking back feedback, which is critical. And that's when things change for them.
Rishi, may I ask you, from an Indian perspective, did we overinvest in Sheikh Hasina?
No, I don't think so. I mean, it's any Indian government would have worked the same way with the Bangladeshi regime that it was friendly towards India. Also, I mean, if you follow defense and intelligence for the longest time, this is not the first time India has worked with leaders in neighboring countries. We've been even closer with some historically. So that I don't think was an issue at all. I think I agree with Smita where she says that, being in power so long, I think somewhere probably Sheikh Hasina lost sight of what the ground reality was, and kind of overplayed her hand when it came to the protests beginning, and even the very fact that she wanted to announce that the reservation itself was overplaying her hand. So I think in that sense, it was a difficult situation because with the Jamaat on one side, they are not very moderate, even though we like to think they are. They're really not very moderate. So India will have an interesting time dealing with them. But so far, I think the response has been quite positive. The Indian High Commissioner in Bangladesh attended the oath-taking ceremony. One of the new ministers has given a positive statement as well. So I think it's a good start. Of course, we'll have to wait and watch and see what happens because situation is quite complex and it's evolving every day. So it'll be interesting to see how it plays out. But I think one thing that, and as usual, the Indian media has oversold this, though there is some truth to it. The external factor in the Bangladesh protests should not be ignored. It didn't clearly happen the way the Indian media has been reporting, the level at which they're reporting it. But there is definitely, I would say China had a big role to play earlier with the India Out movement. And then I would definitely think that America had some role to play after they were denied setting up a base in St. Martin's Island. But again, these things, there's no proof. But unfortunately, there never is. It's only in hindsight, 20 years later, we realize that, America did this. At the time it's happening, there's never any proof. So you can just probably look at the track record and the way things have happened to probably look at that. But again, to say that, I mean, they basically just exploited that situation. The situation was created locally. So you can't really blame them completely on it. But there's definitely a role that they played, both China and the US.
I just have one problem with this. While there will always be those who want to fish in troubled waters in a country like Bangladesh, India, everywhere, where you have a lot of political chess games going on, power rivalry happening in the region, I think the Indian government also needs to think about its reactions all the time. Because what we are doing here is this habit which in the current government does even with its own citizens, forget with Bangladeshis. I mean, this habit of labeling things as external forces constantly without at least acknowledging the basic genuine people's aspiration or people's attachment to a movement. To start, my problem was when you had retired diplomats, including Harsh Shringla, who was a high commissioner in Bangladesh, who was the G20 chief coordinator, and who was hoping for a BJP ticket, who has obviously changed sides. When from the moment something like this happens, you go on an overdrive of saying, अच्छा ये तो चाइना करवा रहा है, ये तो पाकिस्तान करवा रहा है. Take a minute. बहुत देर से आई थी इंडियन गवर्नमेंट की बयान where we said that the interest of the people of Bangladesh is foremost on our mind. That should have been our statement to begin with. That we do on, if people have issues, it's Bangladesh's issues. Do not try and discredit every movement. आप farmers protest को यहाँ पे इंडिया में you constantly label it as Khalistanis. Anything to do with Muslims, you constantly label them as Pakistanis. Any critical media is anti-national. I mean, Bangladesh, if there is an anti-India sentiment in the opposition camp, let's not forget statements made by people like Amit Shah, a home minister of a country, who called Bangladeshis as termites. These things don't go down well with people. You know, people with whom you share such traditional, historic, cultural identity closeness. When your chief ministers like Himanta Biswa Sarma, when I'm forgetting the name of the other person, they are constantly referring to Bangladeshis as Ghuspetiye, as infiltrators. There is a build-up. Just like Rishi was saying that there could be a build-up with what China was doing towards an India Out campaign, there's also a genuine build-up to what the Indian government statement is constantly about Bangladeshi people. And then you are not even giving 1% credit that it could be a genuine students movement, it could be a genuine people's movement, which later on boiled on to a situation where you now have different elements. From the word go, you're wanting to say, nahi to external forces hai. That I think is problematic. We need to draw this lesson from this chapter.
No, I think, yeah, just to Rishi's defense, I mean, I think
sorry, Mitali's been quiet for so long.
No, to Rishi's defense, I mean, I think he made the point fairly well that, the external forces were like use the opportunity given the underlying.
I'm not denying that, Richard. My problem is right from the word go, if as a larger democracy, when at the drop of a hat, you always teach others कि हमारी democracy में आके interfere मत करो. Do not interfere in ye. Other democracies mein what is playing out, don't try and discredit the young people who are out on the streets, people who are dying. There are people, hundreds of people who have died, as saying ki ye external factors hi hain.
I actually have a different question for both of you, which is, it's a two-part question and I'm conscious of time. So I'll, sort of bake both in, which is that even if one were to consider external forces, I think my problem over the last couple of years is everyone else seems to be in the know of what's happening except for India. So, there is this huge student movement happening. Now you're claiming that, you meaning not Rishi, you meaning the government, is claiming that there was, China's been involved, America's been involved. So what is India doing? Like, where is the intelligence feedback? Where is the diplomatic feedback that something really large is building? Because it's not just Bangladesh, right? Things erupted in Sri Lanka, things have erupted in Maldives, and we've spoken about this, Rishi. You've been on our podcast. Things have certainly erupted in Pakistan. This is a neighborhood in a state of disarray, and it always seems like India is reactive rather than that it has seen this coming and is proactively sort of prepared for what sort of responses, what sort of approach. So one is that, like, it really does seem like a little bit of an intelligence failure here, where we just don't see it till it's in front of our nose. And the other one, honestly, is it's I guess it's a digression from Smita's point, but it's that I think it's a moment to pause and reflect on these religious divides that we really seem to drill down within our own borders, but can be quite dangerous considering the neighborhood that we live in. I mean, in any case, of course, I have a problem with it, but especially based on where India is located, to constantly do this Hindu Muslim, and now Bangladesh has again become Hindu Muslim, where it is, the Bangladeshi Hindus are being persecuted. And I was struck by a post by, a Bangladeshi sort of social media influencer saying, please save the Bangladeshi Hindus from the Indian Hindus. We don't want that. It was so it was just, you felt a bit ashamed that you were sort of diving into another country's problem, and diving down on something which was so uncomfortable for them that even they didn't want it. So, to both of you, first of all, why are we so reactive? And secondly, do we need to be really careful about what we're trying to build up as, communal divide within our own country to political benefits, perhaps, on what sort of collateral damage could be happening in the region?
No, see, to your second part, and this I'm saying with a lot of responsibility, Mitali, because people may think I'm critical of this government, but it is the Indian media channels that went in there and जिन्होंने hangama macha diya about Hindus being targeted, Hindus being targeted. You speak to those very reporters who were reporting on air, you speak to them off air, and they'll actually tell you that how exaggerated those reports have been. In some of the cases where the attacks have happened, it's actually proved through, it's because, not because of their communal, it's not because of their religious identity, but because of their linkages to Awami League. Wherever Awami League people are, leaders are, they have been attacked. A lot of them have been detained. A lot of them have gone underground. And that kind of political witch hunt, by the way, is absolutely condemnable. That should stop. Because at the end of the day, if you're going from chaos to chaos, if you're going from one dictatorship to another form of dictatorship, it's not going to help. You can't lay the foundation of a new Bangladesh on the edifice of ruins, and go back to doing the same thing. It was very heartbreaking to see images of BNP and people gone rogue, beating up those who actually wanted to be there for Sheikh Mujibur Rahman's in fact, death anniversary, and in front of his house, people were beating them up, the supporters of Mujibur Rahman. So it's like, if these people had been repressive to you for the last 10 years, you're doing the exact same thing. How are things changed? Where is Poriborton? It's not there. So these reports have been overplayed. Hindus have been attacked, but not in the kind of numbers that have been projected in the initial reports in Indian media. And Indian media has become notorious for overplaying stories. You've had Go India, Go Back campaigns, Indian media Go Back campaigns in Nepal, in Maldives, in Bangladesh. Having been in television, Mitali, you, me, for so long here in Indian television, it hurts us to see that this is where people think that you're coming in and you're basically trying to build your own communal narrative at our cost. And then you have a blowback effect where you actually see these Hindu Sena outfits come and beat up your own Indian Muslim citizens in camps in Ghaziabad. You are doing pelting of stones in Maharashtra in the name of saving Bangladeshi Hindus. So it is extremely sad. It is dangerous. You are playing with the fire again, and it's not going to give you too much of benefits politically if people think that it's going to give them benefits. And yes, I think on your first question, I do believe that New Delhi needs to be a little bit more alert when it comes to a neighborhood which is so politically volatile and sensitive. We have literally not had any inclination of things to come, whether it's been Taliban in Afghanistan, whether it's been the Sri Lankan crisis, whether it's been, the government changing over. Of course, in a reactive manner, we just saw Dr. Jaishankar go to Maldives. I think that was an important visit. There was a certain reset of ties happening, rebalance of ties happening. In Bangladesh right now, though the Indian High Commissioner did attend the oath taking of Mohammad Yunus, but there is a certain anger. Maybe, for all you know, it would be very difficult for him to keep functioning out there, or he will have to lie low for a while. Because we did see in the initial days, it was very saddening to see the cultural center getting burnt down. So much of history has been lost in Bangladesh. I mean, you can burn down the building, you can burn down the house in Dhanmondi where Mujibur Rahman and his entire family was shot down. But this is the history of the country. Do you really want to wipe it away? You can't. You can't wipe it away through bloodshed and violence. So it's really up to the Bangladeshis right now to decide that own path. While there are people, right from Yunus to even Khalida Zia, who, when she was released from house arrest, she came out and she condemned all these attacks against Hindus. So nobody who is in a position of authority there has come out and justified these attacks. Everybody has categorically condemned and not done any politics by saying, no, this is right, or Bangladeshi Hindus actually need to go out. Everybody came out and condemned it in categorical terms. But when you have a violent movement, the churning can often lead to a sort of a political vacuum. You do have a situation there where the students are right now angry at both the traditional parties. They actually want to prop up a third party, a students' party, not
They
again,
they
not
need
in a
Aam Aadmi Party.
yeah, maybe Aam Aadmi Party or Aam Chhatro Party for upcoming elections. When it will be held, I don't know. The last time there was a situation like this, the interim government went on for 2 years, and I don't think Dr. Yunus is somebody who's actually going to let go of power easily. He may come across as a microfinancing economics person, but once you get power, whether it's a Jitan Ram Manjhi, whether it's a Champai Soren, people don't want to let go of power easily, and if they have to let go, then they try and of course make some political moves. So India, yes, I think India definitely needs to up its game as a larger power in the neighborhood of what's really happening, and not just see what it's confirmation bias that is a problem with India right now, which is a media problem. You're wanting to pick up signals which are suited to you and beneficial to you, but you're not wanting to pick up the other sounds from the ground, which essentially then affects your foreign policy making prospects.
Sure. Rishi?
Uh, so when it comes to India's intelligence, whatever I know, it's not like India was blindsided. They did see problems everywhere coming: Afghanistan, Maldives, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka. Uh, I don't know what the plan was and why the reaction was at least perceived to be delayed. But personally, I just want, I mean, what do you think India should have done in Bangladesh? There's only so much you can do. It's a different country. You can't interfere in that country beyond a certain, I mean, diplomatic or even intelligence kind of sector. So there's only so much you can do when the movement is such that they want to kill the prime minister. Then I don't understand what any other country can do in that. So the good part for me, at least, is that at least in Afghanistan, now Maldives, even in Sri Lanka, we've got things back on track very fast. Obviously, not the way they were, but much better than what we were expecting it to be. So within a very short period of time, India has actually done quite well, and now is quite back on track when it comes to Sri Lanka, Maldives, and Afghanistan, of course. Again, that's not defending the fact that probably should have done more to stop these things. But again, I personally, I am quite skeptical of what more India could have done to stop something like this. I don't know.
No, not stop something, Rishi. I think it's just about having your ears to the grounds.
So even if you knew, what could you do?
Not cutting off back channel communications with the oppositions at all.
Well, that depends.
Keep some dialogue open, keep some channels of communication open. All smart countries do that.
Yeah, true.
So
No, but I mean, in Sri Lanka they did. In Afghanistan they did as well. It's just that Maldives and Bangladesh have been a little bit
and
of
I mean, maybe because Sheikh Hasina is somebody who actually enjoys the friendship of cutting across party lines in India. I mean, whether it's the Gandhis, whether it's
Absolutely,
the Congress, whether it's Mr. Modi or whether it's Ms. Mamta Banerjee, no political party will ever stand up here and say that no, Sheikh Hasina ought to now move to a third country. She shouldn't be given asylum here. They will not say that because they have genuine bonding with Sheikh Hasina and Sheikh Mujibur, with the history and all. But having said that, I think if that is the kind of relationship between friends, then you also need to have more honest dialogues. Maybe inside the room, as heads of states and government meet, you could have had more honest conversations.
Yeah, but I think that also has a lot to do with what the local leader, how they are. Like, for example, Sheikh Hasina was completely dictatorial by the end of it. So I think that makes it a little more difficult for an ally to kind of really do too much.
I know we're running out of time, but I have a question which is relevant. One of the points Smita made at the beginning is, part of it is that the government was in power for quite a long time. We have a similar situation in India. Like, is this a preview of things to come in India? Like, are we too long in the current government? We've seen this play out a few times. I mean, yeah. Any thoughts?
I think one of the biggest things that always saves India is its sheer size. It's very difficult to create a national movement like this in India. But having said that, I mean, it's these things snowball much faster than anybody can possibly imagine. But I think at least of what we saw in this last election, and in fact, Smita was one of the few people who called it pretty accurately. The change is now started. I mean, BJP doesn't enjoy the kind of absolute power that they did earlier. one can see the opposition in resurgence. One can see Rahul Gandhi getting sharper and more active in every way. So one can see that yes, maybe not. Yeah, I would imagine within 5 years, but even if not in 5 years, definitely the next term there will be a change. I would say in 5 years. Let's see.
I just want to say quickly, though, Ruchir, on the question that you're asking. I mean, I think, and this is something to be really grateful for, that we have such deep democratic roots and we've managed to sort of hold on to them. At times it has seemed difficult, but India has always done that. We've never been witness to a military coup. But I think the binding factor, if you just step back and look at this at a slightly larger, with a slightly larger framework, is deep economic distress amongst the youth. As a function of joblessness. And I think that is something that is becoming a common strain in this region and other regions as well. But it really, really needs to be addressed. The fact that we have an acute jobs problem in this region, the fact that that leads to much higher frustration about the situation, and also by extension, disengagement with politics and political processes. It's a very sad day when any country's youth starts getting disengaged with their belief in politics or their belief in a government, um, and it doesn't bode well, and it doesn't lead to a good place. So I think that's certainly something to be mindful of. Hopefully, not that there's an uprising of this nature, because that's
Never wish it on this country ever, but I think also the fact that we are perpetually in election mode. कभी state election हो रहे होते हैं, कभी national election हो
I
रहे
mean,
होते हैं, वो
That's
गुस्सा
right.
build up होते होते अगला election आ जाता है, वो election देकर एक पार्टी को गुस्से में चपाट मारते हो आधा गुस्सा निकल जाता है, तो it's a mad situation,
I
but
know we laugh, but I actually think there's something there, Smita. I think that's
yeah,
that might be
yeah.
fairly accurate. Like
Smita,
it
just
gets
Smita,
channeled
I mean,
into.
one
Smita, just
presidential
accept it that you want
elections.
one nation, one election.
वन नेशन वन इलेक्शन या जम्मू कश्मीर इलेक्शन के चक्कर में बेचारे महाराष्ट्र वालों की तो वाट लगा दी. महाराष्ट्र इलेक्शन शुड हैव हैपेंड एंड यू वांट टू डू वन नेशन वन इलेक्शन. मतलब अब करने को बाकी किया महाराष्ट्र में, दो पार्टियों को दो टुकड़ों में कर दिया, अपने सीएम बिठा दिए, फिर भी यू डोंट हैव कॉन्फिडेंस ऑफ गोइंग इनटू इलेक्शन.
Break Congress only once.
You still don't have confidence that you will win Maharashtra, so now you have extended the Maharashtra election by saying, नहीं वाह गणेश चतुर्थी है. अरे भाई साहब, वन नेशन वन इलेक्शन कैसे करवा दिए पूरे देश में? दो स्टेट नहीं हैंडल हो रहे.
All right. It's a great segue to Aapne Suna Kya, so that we can end the show on a lighter note. Who wants to go first?
Well, I can go
Anything.
first. You know,
Go ahead, Rishi.
since we were talking about Bangladesh and Professor Yunus, I just want to, in fact, I just remembered it right now. And there's a short video, and possibly we can post a link of that video when this goes up, about how when Professor Yunus set up the Grameen Bank, they did this project with Denon Yogurt in Bangladesh, where they got Denon, which is a French company, to set up a manufacturing unit in Bangladesh. And they only employed local village women. And the way they developed it and the way they popularized the yogurt itself, the very fact that it was freely available in those villages. And because there was already a milk shortage there, the yogurt kind of helped fill in that gap in that sense. And eventually it actually boosted the health index of that entire region, which was quite an amazing story. And he talks about it in this video. It's like a 5 or 6 minute video. But I saw this maybe in 2009 or 2008 perhaps. And the way he spoke about it, really, it had a deep impact because he talks about social businesses and why people should do things like this. And I was lucky enough to meet him a couple of times after that, thanks to Auntie, which I think who we all know. But it was something that really had a deep impact, and I think that video is something that everyone should see. It really changes the way you think.
Great. Mitali, you want to go next?
No, I actually want to go last, so I'm going to nominate Smita.
I've gone blank right now. I'm just trying to think. I'm like, my brain is fried, poached. I don't know. What should I say? Honestly, I think on Bangladesh, actually, what was the, there's the book by Gary J. Bass. It's called The Blood Telegram. It may be an interesting time for those interested to. It talks about the entire chronology sequence of events that was happening as 1971 was happening, the Kissinger Nixon sort of meetings and conversations, and it has some really interesting insights of what was happening within the US consulate, the US mission there in Bangladesh, and I mean, also some funny incidents of how at one point in time there were actually a couple of people called, uh, it was it was Blood Butcher, the officials within the mission. There was one Blood, there was one Butcher, and I'm forgetting the name of the other person. So it was a weird trio, but I think it's a book that really builds a very good context of what was happening in 1971 in the build up, what was being ignored. So maybe your listeners may like to. It's quite a fat book, and if you get bored, it can come in useful otherwise, but I don't think you'll get bored. It's quite an interesting read, so maybe try and look up the book on the shelves.
Thank you, Smita. My Apne Suna Kya, I was reading a story this morning about astronaut Sunita Williams may have problems with her eyesight because she's in space. And I just wanted to talk about the wider story, which, if you haven't heard, um, basically goes back to NASA's space program and their decision to kill the space shuttle which they had built because it hadn't been as consistent and was fairly expensive. So they handed out two contracts, one to Elon Musk SpaceX and the other to Boeing. If you haven't heard about a range of Boeing's issues, Boeing has three business divisions: defense, airlines, and space program. And they built this shuttle called the Starliner. The Starliner was over budget over time. They were supposed to first launch to the International Space Station in 2018. They finally made it in 2024 after spending something over $6 billion. And even then, when they made it, turns out five of the of the thrusters have some form of leaks, and so they're not operating as well. So the capsule, the Starliner capsule, cannot bring them back unless there is an emergency. So they're planning a backup shuttle, and they apparently SpaceX, which has had success, has built the Crew Dragon, can rescue the astronauts, is not going yet because Boeing would be supremely embarrassed. So they're trying to resolve the issue on their own. And by the way, the other player who can go to the space station is Russia, but they are not even in the equation because of the US Russia dynamics. So right now there are two astronauts stuck on the International Space Station because of American bureaucracy. We complain about India like quite a lot, but here is an example of another government's bureaucracy that is sort of failing to people. I hope they come back safely. That sounds like a crazy story. Yeah, Mitali.
Oh gosh, that's really sad. So I had two, and I was going to talk about the super yacht that sank and has many, many influential people gone missing. But I think we've had enough sort of somber notes. So I will end on a positive note, which was my second Have You Heard? And that is the Australia India Youth Dialogue that is currently underway, and it's happening in Canberra. And I think it was such a moment of pride today. And for those who don't know, everyone on this screen is and has been a part of that
Yeah, there's
Australia
a big conflict of interest here.
big conflict of interest. So the current delegates were at the Parliament, and they had a visit from none other than the Australian Prime Minister. And it really made my heart swell with pride to see where a dialogue, which was really built out of a student movement, has scaled itself to that there is that much recognition, not just from the Australian government, but the Indian government as well. I understand the foreign minister sent sort of a letter of support. And I want to take a second to sort of give a hat tip to Ruchir, who was then a young student. I mean, newsflash, Ruchir was young once, uh, who kind of built this movement and scaled it to see where it's got to. And it's also for people listening in, if you're under 40 and you live in India or Australia, or frankly, if you have sort of citizenship of either country, check it out. See if you want to apply for the next dialogue, which will happen in India. It happens, alternately in India and Australia. And trust me, it really has the potential, depending on what you take from it, it has the potential of being a really, really powerful moment for you professionally. So that's my happy.
You definitely come out with good personal relationships. At least that's been the case for us, more importantly.
And you learn to have a dialogue without sort of pulling each other's eyes.
I want friends.
And the which is I have idea talking about. But
I mean, this podcast is a result of that, so it is a great platform.
Yeah, including Manuraj Sundaram too, by the way. Huh? He's also a conflict of interest.
In action today, but very much a part of both the dialogue and the podcast.
That brings us to the end of this episode. Thank you for listening in. We're always grateful for your feedback. Please email us at theindiadialogue@gmail.com. You can find us at TID_podcast, the India Dialogue _ podcast on Twitter, or India Dialogue Podcast on YouTube. You can find Rishi at Rishi_Suri, Smita at Smita_Sharma, Mitali at Mitali Live, and me at Ruchir_P, all on Twitter or X. We'd
also,
love
my
to hear from
YouTube
you.
station, selfless plug, Smita Sharma Journalist. Please go watch, subscribe. There's a lovely conversation with Mitali there post budget, but a whole bunch of conversations on foreign policy issues, including Bangladesh and West Asia. Smita Sharma Journalist.
Thank you, Smita. And thank you, Smita and Rishi, again for joining us this week. We're super grateful.
Thank you.
See you all again next week. Bye.
Bye.